Hello, this is Montessa Young from Washington County Extension, and I promised you all a recording for irrigation of small acreages. I'm actually going to start from the top of the presentation. We got about halfway through this during our Living on the Land class so that you have access to this. Let me share my screen here. So irrigation of a small acreage. So why do we need to irrigate? So some of you may come from areas where irrigation is not required, that you rely on precipitation and are able to water all the crops you would need out of just that. So on average in the Treasure Valley, we only get 11 inches of annual precipitation. And if you look at the graph on the right-hand side there, you can see that a majority of our precipitation comes in November, December, and January, which is outside of the growing season. To give an example, to grow a pasture from April through October takes 33 inches of moisture on average. So if we're only getting 11 inches, we need to make up that precipitation that's required to grow that crop. So in our area, items that you can grow without irrigation are very limited. So our natural climate does really well for cheatgrass and sagebrush and just a few native plants. So we really rely on irrigation in southern Idaho to be able to grow anything or any crops. So here's a map, and this is looking at, you can see at the top of the map, it says Payette. So this is in between Payette and Emmett. And you can see that our whole area has been shaped by irrigation. So most of our fields are either in pivot circles or rectangles. The areas that are not irrigated are that light brown color. You can see even in the valleys of the natural, just where the natural moisture things, it's a little bit greener, but probably not enough to be able to grow a crop. And so we have the river comes through. We can see a couple large canals going through this area. So even how our whole properties are set up is all based off of being able to irrigate them. So we have to talk about water rights when we talk about irrigation. Water disputes have been around for a very long time. So there's this long history of water rights and water diversions, government intervention, lawsuits, dams, canals, and bankruptcy. And through all this, they've come up with our current water rights system. So in Idaho, all waters are public waters. And a water right is the right to divert public waters and put them to a beneficial use in accordance with one's priority date. So you'll hear people say first in time, first in right. So if you were originally had a water right to your property that was in the early 1900s versus someone that gained a water right in the 2000s, your water right gets to come out first before theirs does. So you can see that an older water right would be very beneficial because then you have access to the water on short water years. Most of us are going to be on an irrigation district or a part of a private irrigation company, and they actually own the water rights or the water storage rights, and they distribute the water. So a lot of our water rights are going to come from an irrigation district or private irrigation companies. But some of you may have water rights straight out of a Snake River or the Payette River that are based on these older water rights. So the picture in the corner is the Boise Project Main Canal, and that's back in 1940 when that was constructed. So what about groundwater? So water rights are basically surface water rights, but all groundwaters in the state are declared to be property of the state as well. So even if your property is over the top of that groundwater, the state still owns that. The use of groundwater may be required only by appropriation. So the Idaho Department of Water Resources requires a water right approval before issuing a drilling permit for an irrigation well. And it's typical for these applications to take 3 to 4 months to go through. And there's a couple things they look at. They must not reduce the quantity of water for an existing right holder. So if you're going to put in a larger and deeper well right next to a smaller, shallower well, they're going to look at that and say, oh, you might take water away from that existing right holder. It has to be in the public interest. The water supply has to be sufficient for the proposed use. and must not be for delay or speculation. So you can't go out and get a water right for a well today and then not drill that well as a speculative matter. Domestic wells do not require appropriation, but do require a well construction permit. So from a domestic well, you're allowed to irrigate of up to a half an acre of land, and your total use may not be in excess of 13,000 gallons per day. So in general, your domestic well is not going to be enough to be able to irrigate any size of property. You know, this half acre of land will get your typical subdivision lawn, but not much larger than that. We're lucky in Idaho that due to our geology is we actually store water very easily. So we have very large aquifers. There's the Snake River Basin aquifer. That's a basalt aquifer. We're sitting on top of a sedimentary volcanic aquifer here in the Treasure Valley. As you can see throughout the state, there's lots of large aquifers. So these are just porous areas of bedrock that hold water very easily. So we're fortunate to have all these groundwater resources. So an allotment, if you belong to an irrigation district or company, you get a total acre feet of water granted to every paid irrigatable acre, and it's determined on the amount of storage water for the season. Your water allotment is often going to be expressed in acre feet. So 1 acre foot would cover 1 acre of ground with 12 inches deep of water. So if we think back about that pasture that needed 33 inches throughout the season, that would be, you know, close to 3 acre feet of water that you would need to irrigate that pasture. A water year is generally mid-April through mid-October of each year. The water gets turned on and off based on weather and what the storage levels are. So if it is a short water year, they'll try to hold off as long as they can in the spring before they turn that water on. And short water years may mean an early shutoff. So if the reservoir is dry, the water is going to go away. You can't save your allotment. So let's say that it's a short water year and the water is going to get turned off August 1st. It doesn't matter if you've used your allotment or not. The water is going to be gone out of the canals and you're not going to have access to it. So there's not a good way to save it up for later on the short water years. So you can keep tabs on your reservoir. This is a U.S. Bureau of Reclamation site, hydromet data, and it'll show you where we are at this point in time for all the reservoirs. So in 2018, looking at the thing, we are looking fairly good for a water year. Most of our reservoirs are in that 80 to 90% full range. So here's a picture. This would be January 24th, and you know we're at March 5th now, but we're looking just a little bit fuller than it was in this picture. So looking to be a decent water year, even though we've had a fairly dry winter. We had such a wet winter last year that we went into this season with quite a bit of storage. So from the irrigation company, it's all going to begin at a head gate. So this picture kind of shows what your head gate may look like on your property, usually a concrete structure with a wheel. And so this will raise or lower a gate that controls how much irrigation water comes into your company. So this gate is open and closed by your ditch rider. And so you need to contact your irrigation company and figure out who your ditch rider is. In some rural areas, you're allowed to control your own gate. On some rural areas and in good water years. And in poor water years, they're going to have tight control of these gates. And sometimes there'll actually be padlocks on them so you can't change your own water. So you call in an order for water to the irrigation company or district. A lot of them will say they want to know 24 hours ahead of time. The ditch rider comes out and opens up the gate for you. It said in times of plenty of water, you may be able to adjust your own gate, and in times of water scarcity, this will probably be locked. And the ditch rider keeps track of how much you are taking and for how many days. So it's important to call and have him close off your gate when you're done with your water so that you're not using too much of your allotment at a time. So after the head gate, we have all these different varieties of irrigation systems that we can use. So under the flood and gravity systems, we have a hose or siphon tubes or gated pipe, Under sprinkler, we have hand lines, wheel lines, pods, big guns, and pivots. And then we also have drip irrigation as an option. So I'm going to walk through each of these and kind of explain the good parts and the bads of these irrigation systems. So siphon tubes. These are our traditional way of watering. They're actually fairly effective and still used in many areas. You need a field with a consistent at least 1% slope, sloping away from your main ditch. You're going to have to corrugate that field. So corrugation can be tough in things like pastures. It's easier to do in row crops. Then you're going to set siphon tubes. There's a special little trick to getting that siphon to work. Siphon tubes come in different sizes. So you can see in this picture they're actually using 2 siphon tubes per row. This is common on a first watering of a season when you really need to push a lot of water to get it to go down through the field. Tubes are usually on either 12 or 24-hour sets. So you come out in the morning and set all these and then either change them at night or wait again all the way to the next morning. Kind of depends on your soil and your length of field. The tubes can plug. So if the water drops in that ditch unexpectedly, let's say that dam that you're seeing there leaks too much, they can all unset. If you have a dog go down through there, they can unset your tubes. And even weeds and stuff in the irrigation water can clog up a tube. So it can be labor intensive to keep these set if you have these factors in there that are unsetting them for you. But overall, this is a pretty affordable, flexible water delivery system and pretty simple to operate. So next is another flood irrigation method is gated pipe. Once again, you're going to need a field with at least a 1% slope. Needs to be corrugated. This gated pipe comes in different sizes and gate widths to match your corrugating rolls. You need a slope also away from the water source or put in a series of risers to get the water to flow through the gated pipe to begin with. These gates can plug, usually with larger weeds, sometimes dead rodents. Things can get trapped in your gates, but don't plug or unset quite as easily as siphon tubes do. The pipes themselves are pretty heavy and long to transport, so you have special trailers. Usually takes 2 people to get the gated pipe on and off the field. And also if you're burning weeds, gated pipe is made out of plastic and will burn pretty easily, so a lot of people lose their gated pipe when their weed burning gets out of control in the late fall. They're pretty convenient to set, water, affordable, and pretty simple to operate. So those are some of the advantages. You can see on that, the bottom right-hand picture is a screen system. So that's what I'm talking about, one example of risers. And so the water comes up through the middle and has to go through the screen on the outside. And you see it's collecting some of that sediment that would come in the irrigation water. So then sprinklers. If you're going to do a sprinkler, it's going to be a pressurized system, which means you're going to need a pump. And the pump has to be appropriate sized for how much water that's available out of your well or out of your pond. The available power source that you have, whether you have 120 or 220 or 3-phase power. The head, so this is the height from your water source to the highest sprinkler. The number of sprinklers you have, what type of sprinklers they are, and the crop that is being watered. So this is not an easy system to design. This is not a one-size-fits-all. You're going to need an adequate sump, which is where the water is going to collect around the pump, and a screen. And you have to think the larger pumps are going to be pretty expensive to operate, and some of them with higher power requirements are going to require a permit and hookup by Idaho Power. So if we look at the graph here, this is showing total head and feet on the left-hand side and gallons per minute on the bottom. So if we look at pump A, which is a larger pump at 5 horsepower, if you had, only 80 feet ahead needed, it would pump, 140 gallons per minute. And if you back up that you have 180 feet of head, then it's going to only pump 10 gallons per minute. So as you can see, there's a lot of fluctuation based on size of pump, the gallons per minute, and the total head that you have to push against. So I recommend finding an irrigation dealer that is used to dealing with small acreages and can walk you through choosing a pump. I don't recommend going to just a supply store and picking up the easiest trash pump that they have there. That's probably not going to be heavy enough or able to pump the water that you need for an irrigation system. So hand lines. So hand lines don't require core gates or an even slope, and these are actually moved by hand, is how they got their names. Does require a lot of physical work, so one person in good shape can move a hand line, but it's not an easy day. They have very even application patterns, less overall water use compared to gravity irrigation. The riser pipes that they hook into, these will need to be permanently installed along the side of the field. So you can see that in that bottom right-hand picture. The pipe is actually dug underground and the risers pop up, and that's what you attach the hand lines to. So these pipes are going to need to be moved for any field operations. So if this was a hay field, you'd have to move it for cutting and baling. If it's in a pasture, you'll have to keep the animals fenced off of it. They will chew right through the top of your hand line there. They have all day to play with it. So hand lines and animals don't often mix. So that's something to think of hand lines is the physical labor required to get them out there, and then having to move them anytime you need to be in that field. So one step up from hand lines are wheel lines. These don't require a flat or corrugated field. They can go over some fairly rough terrain, but they can get stuck, so you got to have a clear path for that motor to run through. These can be moved by a single person. They can be used on larger fields, so up to a half mile in width. These are connected to risers with flexible pipe. So you do need to change risers as it moves down the field and have those risers installed. These apply water very evenly. There's less physical labor than with hand lines. They are more expensive than hand lines there and more maintenance. And every now and then they can get stuck in muddy, rocky, or uneven ground. And if you can imagine, it sticks and you don't notice and the water keeps applying, that you can get a pretty muddy mess to have to go and rescue your wheel line out of. So a latest innovation, and this is for use around animals, that kind of has a protective thing around the sprinkler, are K-line or Irripods, and these are brand names of this system. They're a pipeline sprinkler irrigation system for pasture forage crops. They have a very flexible configuration, so you could have one pod, I think up to 8 pods on a line. They're moved with a four-wheeler, so you actually grab the end of the hose and drag them along. One comment from the irrigation supplier was moved with a good four-wheeler. So once these are full of water, they're actually pretty heavy. And she said, so people have saved money on their irrigation system and then had to go out and buy a better four-wheeler than they had to be able to move them around. They can be used with animals in the pasture, so they're protected from being chewed on. And fairly affordable. So a 5-pod system, estimated cost, I don't have it listed here, but it's going to be in that $4,000 to $5,000 range. So your first pod costs the most, and adding the other ones. One thing when you're pricing these out is you can get this whole system on a pallet, and you can bring it to your own house and assemble it yourself. They said it just takes simple tools. Or you can purchase it installed, and they'll send out a technician that's done this before and line out the pipe and put them on. They said the hardest part is that pipe's been wound up on that pallet, and it takes a while for it to relax so that you can attach the other pods to it. So a big gun is just a large sprinkler mounted on a wheeled cart, and you typically move this with a small tractor. They require pretty high operating pressure just because they need to shoot a long distance. So about 80 psi to the sprinkler. And then lots of travel through that hose main line and drive mechanism may require extra pressure. So you may need a pump that can output 150 psi, and this increases your cost of using this big gun. Super easy to install because they're not meant as a permanent installation. Can accommodate some odd-shaped field. But this is going to have less even watering. You're going to have more water applied closer to the gun and less water applied further out. And they are pretty susceptible to wind. So on a windy day, that spray can get moved over. But a good choice for irrigating a large area. So you may not think of pivots or lateral moves as a small acreage thing, but they do make short little mini pivots. So your common full-size pivot is going to irrigate a 125-acre circle. So that's pretty big size. But they do make these mini pivots or towable pivots for small acreages. Sometimes they don't have the height, so doing a crop like corn is going to be a little difficult with these smaller pivots. Lateral move pivots don't go in a circle. They go straight down the field, kind of like a wheel line would, but still elevated above the ground. These tend to be very efficient. No physical labor is required to move them, and they can be automated. So work off of a weather station and move in response to the weather and what your crop needs. But they're a pretty complex system. They're going to be one of your more expensive choices for irrigation. And if they do either freeze or hit some unexpected mud or ruts, they can tip over, which requires setting them back up, and also sometimes that will damage the pivot. So still have to keep an eye on them, even though they're automated and fancy. So the last one is drip irrigation. One of the challenges with drip irrigation is you're going to need a very clean water supply or an adequately sized filter. So in our areas, we see a lot of drip irrigation on onions, and they're using huge sand filters. So if you've ever seen the big silver tanks on the side of a field that's under drip irrigation, that would be their sand filters. Drip irrigation is very, very efficient. You're just watering right in the root system. And no physical labor after you get it installed, but quite a bit of physical labor to lay all that pipe down. They do have pipe reels that they use on the back of tractors, but you manually have to put all those pipes into that blue plastic main line at the head of the field. It works with really low pressure and low volume, so if you don't have a large pump or you don't have a water source that provides a lot of water at one time, drip irrigation may be a choice. It does only work for select crops. In our area, they tend to put them in just for one season because they're susceptible to damage by rodents. So your gophers and voles in the wintertime go searching for water and chew right through your drip irrigation to get to it. Also, if you're running equipment in that field, or even just your simple shovel or hoe can go right through some of this drip irrigation tape. So some of the good parts is it's very efficient and very easy, and the bad part is that we haven't figured out a way to make it sustainable. So thinking about irrigating, there's a lot of things we have to take into account when we're scheduling how often we're going to irrigate. So first off is what soil you have, how much water it can hold, how fast water infiltrates, how fast it drains out of the bottom of the soil profile, what crop you're trying to grow, how deep are the roots of that crop, what's the evapotranspiration. So a crop like corn tends to have a very high evapotranspiration rate compared to something smaller like a grass or pasture crop. And the weather. So wind is a huge factor in our area. Very windy days can cause you to use twice the amount of water that you would otherwise. Evaporation, we tend to have very low humidity, which increases your evaporation rate off of your field. And then precipitation. So every now and then you will get precipitation, and then that can change your irrigation scheduling. But as I said, most of our precipitation is showing up during the winter, and we don't get so much during the summer. So soil properties. So if we look at the rooting depth in feet, this is going to change how often we need to water. So an alfalfa crop can have roots from 4 feet to 6 feet deep. So often, if this is gravity irrigated, they'll only water once per cutting. You can really go a long way. So if you've got something like pasture, it tends to have a shorter rooting system, so more in that 1.5 feet, 18 inches range. And so then you're going to have to water that more often. And then your soil properties matter. So if you have clay soil, when you water, you're going to get a wide but more shallow infiltration. And if you have sand, the water's going to go straight down, but it's not going to store for very long or sub out very far. So if you're looking at like drip irrigation in sand, you'd have to have your emitters much closer together than you would in clay. And you have to be careful in clay just how fast you put water on, because it doesn't soak into the ground very well, and so you could have runoff or ponding if you try to put water on too quickly. So the amount of water that a soil can hold changes with texture. So that bottom line on the graph is your wilting point. So this is the point which your crop cannot draw any more water out of the soil. And this top line is your field capacity. So that's the most water that your field can hold. And you notice that doesn't go up to 50%. That top line is only 40% by volume. So about half of soil is mineral content. And so we're really trying to balance the air and water in the other half. So your field capacities are going to be, you know, if you have a sand down in that 10% water content, and then your highest are going to be in your heavier textures like your clay loam, silty clay, and clay. And you can kind of see in the picture to the right the soil particles and the air and water. So at field capacity, we still have some air in the soil. And at permanent wilting point, all that water is tightly attached to the soil, enough that the plants have trouble sucking it up. And then different crops are going to have different evapotranspiration. So if you're watering a pasture in July and August, how much water should you apply and how often? We'll kind of go through an example here. So for silt loam, your water holding capacity is going to be about 2 inches per foot. So we saw that on the last diagram, your water holding capacity. Your pasture rooting depth is going to be about 2 feet. So overall, if you water your pasture, you're going to need about 4 inches. So that's the 2 inches per foot times 2 foot rooting depth to adequately water that pasture. Assuming that the soil isn't at like the permanent wilting point, and you've only dried out to about 50% of your available water holding capacity. So if your soil is super, super dry, you're going to need a little bit of this just to wet up the soil again. So if you need 4 inches, and the evapotranspiration rate in March is, or in July there, let's say, is about 0.2 inches per day. So you take 4 divided by the 0.2, you could get away with watering this nice silt loam pasture about every 8 days. So that's just an example of how the math works for figuring out the water. So if you look at the difference between alfalfa pasture and apples, you can see, of course, that the most water is needed in that August range, but that they do need differing amounts of water. And alfalfa and apples are both a perennial crop. So if you had to prioritize who's going to get the water, you'd probably choose these crops that are perennial crops. So finding all this crop water use information, it's actually updated during the growing season every day. Once again, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation site. This time you're looking for Agromet. And they have stations all over southern Idaho, so you just want to find the stations that's closest to you to get local information. One of the best ways is to actually go out there and feel the soil. So some people will dig a small handful and use their hands to see how much moisture is in the soil. I've even seen people in turf, do the screwdriver test. So can you poke the screwdriver down in, and how far do you reach moisture? So that's kind of the less scientific way to figure out when the next time to irrigate is, but probably just as effective. So if you have any questions for me, since I'm not doing this in a live broadcast, you can always email me or call me. My email is montessay@uidaho.edu, and phone number is 208-414-0415. But just kind of a synopsis, irrigation water is super important to grow any crop in our area. It's important to know how your irrigation district or irrigation company works as far as water payments and water delivery when you're moving to a new property. You need to choose an irrigation system that matches your property, your ability to invest. Some of these can be pretty expensive. Your physical abilities, the crop you're growing, and your overall goals for your property. I recommend getting expert help in choosing and installing an irrigation system. There's a lot of factors to consider when you look at pump size and water availability. You need to utilize your irrigation system properly by knowing your soil type and your crop's evapotranspiration to be able to schedule those irrigations correctly. I'd like to give special thanks to Warrington Irrigation in Ontario, Oregon. I stopped in there and they talked to me for a good hour, sharing their wisdom on common problems they see with small farm irrigation systems. And I've tried to share some of those with you today, but they are a good resource for the small farmer to go in and talk about their irrigation system. Okay, thank you for listening.